The title of our sermon this morning is Living with Imperfection. The human mind craves order and symmetry. It scans the landscape, looking for things to be in their proper place. This is because our mind doesn't like loose ends or unresolved issues. If something breaks, we fix it. And so things like ambiguity and uncertainty are things that we try to avoid at all costs. And yet, no matter how much we try to create an environment that keeps things in order, we nevertheless find ourselves surrounded by imperfection. We are not always the perfect spouse, parent, or friend. We're not always proud of our choices. We don't always handle ourselves perfectly at the workplace or in resolving conflicts. And things like challenges with a job or health or money or a relationship gives us this unsettled, anxious feeling of things not being right. It's interesting, in building a new home, there is a Chinese tradition when tiling the roof to leave 3 tiles off of that new roof to represent how even heaven isn't perfect. In the making of Persian rugs, an imperfect stitch is sewn into every rug produced to represent a similar idea. Imperfections are built into this beautiful cathedral. Our eye expects to see straight lines and perfect symmetry, but the columns and arches and walls are not actually symmetrical, again, to represent the fact that no one is perfect but the Lord. Now, part of us rebels at this idea of perfection always being beyond our reach. We want things to be neat and tidy, and it goes against our sensibilities to have these loose ends, these unresolved issues, because the human mind is looking for satisfaction. It wants things to be just right so that we can move on. So is the pursuit of perfection something of a fool's errand? What's the point of setting goals, of establishing high standards, of aiming for the ideals of heaven, if none of these can be achieved perfectly? In what way is that satisfying? And what is the alternative? What should we settle for? Mediocrity? Half-hearted attempts? Compromise? Second best? So you see, we live in this seemingly unresolved tension between 2 opposites. On the one hand, that of expecting our goals and dreams to be eventually fulfilled, and on the other hand, knowing that we will fall short and fail. In today's sermon, I'd like us to consider the possibility that there's actually beauty in imperfection. Beauty because the rough, frayed edges of human effort, of trial and error, of misunderstanding and hurt stand not as a monument to failure, but as a humble testimony of all good people who are trying to follow the one who is perfect. And so the goal today is to see how we might learn to live more comfortably, maybe even at peace, with the imperfection in and around us. And rather than getting depressed or deflated by the reality that our lives don't always match up to the ideal, maybe we could view the ideal in a different way. as a motivating force and as a contrast or opposite that produces a healthy tension that keeps us moving forward and inspires us to keep trying and improving and getting better so that we may live more and more in the image and likeness of God. Winston Churchill once said, "Success is the ability to go from failure to failure with no loss in enthusiasm." And I love that because it illustrates the point that human failure is not a curse. It's not something to be embarrassed about or hide from either. In fact, the Lord's word invites us to get comfortable with it because all human progress and development, all spiritual growth, cannot happen in a vacuum. We're specifically taught that we learn and grow and mature spiritually by seeing opposites, by living within that tension, by trial and error, and by making mistakes. The Lord spoke to this when he said, "Those who are well do not need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." But still, no one wants to look weak and vulnerable, and they certainly don't want their mistakes being paraded around or advertised to the world. And it's interesting that we live in a society that puts a premium on winning. The world is divided into winners and losers. If you're not doing amazing things, clearly there's something wrong with you. And in this world of fierce competition, if you don't come out on top, someone else will. And so there's this subtle messaging from society that we need to look like we have it all together. And it's interesting that you can think of the scribes and Pharisees as being those in the New Testament, that group of people who specialized in looking good. They presented themselves as the ones who had it all together, who were living a religious life in the right way, which is code for the perfect way. Spiritually speaking, I think it's important for us to realize that the pressure to think that our life should be free of problems, free of constraints, is a pressure that does not come from the Lord or his angels. And in fact, we're taught in the new church that the hells or evil spirits are actually the source of this pressure, and that this pressure is actually a trap. We're taught that evil spirits are the ones to insert the idea that we should be perfect, pure in thought, pure in intention. Because as soon as we start thinking that way, then they move in to accuse and condemn us. That's the wording. Constantly. To accuse and condemn. How come you're not living up to that standard? In the Word, the Lord turns this idea of winners and losers upside down on its head. After he sat down, Jesus called the 12 and said to them, "If anyone desires to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all." And then in another place, "So the last will be first and the first last." So here's one of our first lessons in this subject, that this desire to be first in all things, first in being right, first in winning, first in coming out on top, gets us into all sorts of problems because it places our own stubbornness and pride in the primary spot, and humility and serving others in the secondary spot. And as long as we put self first and others second, we will view life through the lens of winners and losers. Those who are doing it right and those who are doing it wrong. This reminds me of a friend's comment that he likes to kind of mutter under his breath when there's an argument going on or someone's trying to come out on top, and he just says, I'll take the bronze. I'll take the bronze. The interesting thing about in Olympics is that we forget about the person that wins the bronze because we're looking at those who win the gold. We remember their names, but not necessarily the bronze, and yet the bronze may be just 1/10 of a second or 1/100th of a second behind the gold. So the "I'll take the bronze" comment is, I don't need to be first. And I love that. I think it's a good reminder when we're thinking about this subject of perfection. I want to share with you a word about angels. Human beings, or people in general, tend to put angels on a pedestal. And in fact, in some religions, angels are thought to be a separate creation, not even from this world, because the thinking is, or the human mind cannot get its head around the idea that someone from this world could possibly be one of those angels. And even in the new church, angels get put on a pedestal as perfect, or at least as people that we have no hope of possibly being like. And yet, the people who populate heaven, our loved ones and friends who have moved on from this world into the next, good people, people from this world. And so in our reading today from Heaven and Hell 158, we learn these wonderful reminders that angels go through changes of state like us. They have their ups and downs. They have a proprium, or self, like us. But the most telling and important lesson is that they aren't perfect. They're not pure, without blemish or fault. So I invite you to pause just for a moment and sit with this revelation about angels. So what are we using as our measurement for success? How are we pacing ourselves? Is life in this world a race? And spiritually speaking, what do we imagine the finish line to be? Because if no one, including angels, achieve perfection, then maybe we need to tell our spirit, our impatient mind, to slow down. Yes, our regeneration is a critically important component of our spiritual life. But I'm not sure that regeneration is a race. When we turn to the Lord's Word, we see from beginning to end an invitation to us to make small incremental changes. The Lord said to the Israelites, "Little by little, I will drive your enemies away from you." So when it comes to pacing ourselves, let's make sure our hearts and minds are aligned with the expectations of the Lord. Unlike the expectations of the world and society and the false promises of the hells, the Lord does not expect perfection from us, not in this world or the next. Now, obviously, the Lord wants us to set goals. He wants us to strive to do our very best. He wants us to shun evils and not settle for mediocrity. He wants us to hold ourselves accountable to the highest standards. And these are all necessary goals. And they are, in fact, the fuel that keeps us going. And things like planning for the future. Where would we be if we couldn't plan for the future? It's what makes life enjoyable. But expecting or demanding perfect results from ourselves and others can only lead to one thing: frustration or disappointment or hurt. When the Lord said in the Gospel of Matthew, "You shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect," it was a reference to one's effort. The Greek word for perfect is teleos, which means whole or complete. A whole or complete effort to shun evil and do good is what the Lord asks of us. Nothing more, nothing less. So the Lord said to the rich young ruler, "If you want to be perfect, go sell what you have and give to the poor, and come follow me." This is such a beautiful prescription for our happiness. To sell means, symbolically, to let go of or shun unhealthy attachments, things that stick to us that we just cannot let go of, anger and resentment and unkind thoughts and feelings. To sell spiritually is to pray to the Lord to detach ourselves from these things. Giving to the poor means to serve others, to think of others, is to not be the first. It's looking to use. And the follow me is what we try to do each Sunday, is spend some time on the Sabbath to read the Lord's word and go to him, strive to follow him in his word. And the point in this story is that our efforts in this regard won't be perfect, but they will be whole or sincere. And this is why we don't need to be ashamed or embarrassed by imperfect results, because as one teaching at the beginning of the book, Secrets of Heaven, says, there is no point in time when anyone can say, "Now I am perfect." So in conclusion, it's important for us to realize that we live in a world that promotes an unhealthy pursuit of perfection. Advertising companies spend millions of dollars promising the perfect look. TV shows and movies reduce life into winners and losers, those who are successful and those who are not. And if something isn't perfect in your life, throw it out and start again. The Lord in his word presents such a refreshingly simple alternative. Our peace, our joy, our sense of accomplishment rests in the little things, in those small acts of everyday thoughtfulness and kindness, in seeing our imperfection and the imperfection of others as a testimony to human effort, to mistakes, to trial and error. And to see these things as the desire of good people around us who are striving to live in the image and likeness of God. And let us let go of the illusion that life should be some sort of race, a race to rid ourselves of all problems and challenges, to rid ourselves of constraints or opposites or tension, or to rid ourselves of imperfection. And let us appreciate this gift of life which the Lord has given us. And perhaps we can live comfortably, even at peace, knowing that we are not, as we learn today, regenerated in a single space of time, but are being regenerated throughout our entire life, and even in the next life. Amen.